Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. There are moments in history when the boundary between the living and the dead seems to collapse entirely, moments when the earth itself seems to reject what we've buried, when the graves we thought were final resting places become something else, something restless, something wrong. October 31st, 1903, in Clay Hollow, Kentucky, was one of those moments. When the sun rose on November 1st, the townspeople emerged from their homes to find their cemetery transformed into a scene that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. Graves had been opened. Not dug up, not excavated by tools or hands, but opened from within as though something beneath the soil had pushed upward with terrible force. Caskets lay shattered, their lids splintered and broken outward. Earth was displaced in patterns that made no sense, mounded around the graves in ways that suggested not digging, but eruption, as though the ground itself had exhaled. The sheriff, a practical man named Jacob Thornton, who'd served in the Spanish-American War and thought he'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, stood at the edge of the cemetery that morning and wrote in his report, a report that would be sealed within weeks and hidden from public view for decades, that the soil looked pushed upward by breath, as though the earth itself had drawn air into lungs it shouldn't possess, and then expelled it with force enough to crack wood and stone. What happened in Clay Hollow over those final days of October 1903 remains one of the most disturbing and unexplained mysteries in American history. It's a story that was deliberately buried, suppressed by officials who couldn't explain it and didn't want to try. It's a story that combines eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and elements so profoundly unsettling that even now, more than a century later, it resists comfortable explanation. This is that story. Not the sanitized version that appeared briefly in newspapers before being pulled from circulation. Not the official explanation about geological instability and methane gas that satisfied no one who actually witnessed the events. But the real account, pieced together from surviving documents, private letters, testimony given in whispers, and the evidence that still exists in that patch of Kentucky earth where a town once stood and where, according to some, the ground has never truly settled. It begins with a coal mine and a disaster that killed 37 men. And it ends, though ends might not be the right word, with graves that wouldn't stay closed, with the dead who seemed determined to return to the world of the living, and with questions about what lies beneath our feet, waiting in the darkness, that have never been answered. Clay Hollow wasn't much of a town even in its prime. Nestled in a valley in eastern Kentucky, surrounded by hills thick with oak and hickory, it existed for one reason: coal. The Hollow Creek mine, opened in 1897, employed nearly every able-bodied man in the area and brought enough prosperity to support a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, and about 200 residents living in modest houses clustered along the creek that gave the mine its name. It was the kind of place that appears on few maps, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where life was hard but predictable, governed by the rhythms of the mine, the morning whistle that called men into the earth, the evening whistle that brought them back to the surface, the Sunday services where families thanked God for another week of survival and prayed for continued safety in the darkness below. But Clay Hollow was marked by tragedy long before the graves began opening themselves. In September of 1901, disaster struck in a way that would forever scar the small community, and some would argue, awaken something in the earth itself that should have remained sleeping. It happened on a Tuesday morning, just after the day shift had descended into the mine, 300 feet below the surface, in the main gallery where men worked with pickaxes and dynamite to tear coal from ancient stone. Something went wrong. The official report would later blame structural instability and improper support construction, but the miners' families knew better. They knew the company had been cutting corners, reducing the number of support beams, pushing men to dig faster and deeper to meet quotas and maximize profits. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. A section of the tunnel ceiling collapsed with a sound that survivors described as the earth screaming. tons of rock and dirt came crashing down, crushing some men instantly and trapping others in pockets of space that became their tombs. The collapse triggered secondary cave-ins throughout the mine. Within minutes, 3 entire galleries had been sealed off, buried under debris too heavy and unstable to move safely. 37 men were trapped. For 3 days, rescue efforts continued. Crews worked around the clock, trying to dig through the rubble, listening for sounds of life from below. For the first 24 hours, they heard tapping, the signal miners used to communicate through rock, desperate messages in code that said, "We're alive, we're here, please hurry." But as the hours stretched on, the tapping grew weaker and then stopped altogether. On the 4th day, another collapse threatened the rescue workers, and the company made a decision that would haunt Clay Hollow for years to come. They sealed the mine permanently. The trapped men, those who hadn't already died from their injuries or suffocation, were left where they'd fallen, entombed in the earth they'd spent their lives excavating. The company cited safety concerns and financial impossibility. It would cost too much to recover the bodies, they said. It was too dangerous to continue. The families would receive compensation. Everyone should move on. But you don't move on from something like that. Not in a community as tight-knit as Clay Hollow. Not when you know that your husband, your father, your brother is still down there in the darkness, trapped in a tomb of stone, denied even the dignity of a proper burial. The mine company's decision created a wound in the community that never healed, a sense of injustice and wrongness that festered like an infection. Memorial services were held. A monument was erected near the sealed mine entrance, with 37 names carved into stone. Families grieved as best they could, holding funerals without bodies, saying prayers over empty caskets or grave markers that represented men who would never rest in the town cemetery because they were already buried, deep in the earth, in a grave not of their choosing. The town changed after the disaster. It became quieter, more withdrawn. The laughter that used to echo from the houses along Hollow Creek died away. Church attendance increased, but the services took on a somber, almost fearful quality, as though the congregation was seeking protection from something they couldn't name. Old superstitions that had been fading in the face of industrial progress came roaring back. Talk of haints and tokens, of the dead who couldn't rest, of debts the earth would eventually collect. Reverend Samuel Phelps, who'd led the Clay Hollow Community Church for 15 years, began preaching sermons about sin and judgment, about the wages of greed and the need for repentance. He spoke of Korah and his followers, swallowed by the earth for their rebellion. He spoke of the dead rising at the end of days. His sermons grew darker, more apocalyptic, as though he sensed something approaching that his faith could name but not prevent. And people began to notice things. Small things at first. Animals refusing to walk near certain areas. Dogs barking at nothing in the middle of the night. Strange sounds, distant thuds and creaks that seemed to come from beneath the ground. Mines settle after collapses. Everyone knew that. The earth shifts and adjusts. It was natural. It meant nothing, except it didn't feel natural. It felt wrong. It felt like the earth itself was uneasy, like something beneath the town was moving, adjusting, preparing. The mine never reopened. The company, facing lawsuits and bad publicity, shuttered their operations in Clay Hollow entirely. Most of the miners who'd survived found work elsewhere and moved away. The town's population dwindled. Those who remained were mostly the families of the trapped men, people who couldn't leave, who felt bound to the place where their loved ones lay entombed, who maintained a vigil over ground that held secrets and sorrows they couldn't bear to abandon. By the autumn of 1903, Clay Hollow was a ghost town in all but name. Fewer than 80 people still called it home. The general store was barely surviving. The school had closed for lack of students. Only the church remained vital, its congregation clinging to faith, as the only thing that made sense in a world that had become cruel and incomprehensible. This was the Clay Hollow that approached Halloween of 1903, a town already haunted, already marked by tragedy, already standing at the edge of something it didn't understand. A town where the living walked carefully, as though afraid of disturbing the dead who lay beneath them, some in the cemetery on the hill, others deeper still, trapped in collapsed tunnels that honeycombed the earth like wounds that wouldn't heal. And in those final days of October, as the leaves turned colors and fell. As the air grew colder and the nights longer, something began to happen, something that would transform Clay Hollow from a forgotten tragedy into a legend. From a mining town that failed into the site of one of the most disturbing and unexplained events in American history, the earth was preparing to give back what it had taken. And the dead were preparing to rise. The first grave to open belonged to Elias Turner. He'd been one of the trapped miners, a man of 34 who'd left behind a wife and 3 young children. His family had held a funeral for him, even though his body remained sealed in the mine, erecting a marker in the cemetery as a place to mourn, a symbol of a man who'd never properly rest. On the morning of October 25, 1903, Elias's widow, Martha, walked to the cemetery as she did every morning to place flowers on her husband's grave. What she found there made her drop the flowers and begin screaming loud enough to wake half the town. The grave was open, not dug up in the conventional sense, but erupted, as though something had burst upward from below with tremendous force. The earth was displaced in a rough circle around the marker, mounded up in irregular heaps, and most disturbing of all, in the center of the disturbed ground, there was a depression, a hollow space that went down into darkness. As though the earth had been pushed aside to create a passage, men came running from the town. They stood at the edge of the grave, looking down into that darkness, none of them willing to be the first to descend. Someone brought a lantern and lowered it on a rope. The light revealed what they'd all feared and none had wanted to see. There was no casket. Or rather, there were pieces of what had been a casket, splintered wood, bent nails, fragments of the pine box that had been buried 2 years earlier. But the pieces weren't arranged as they should be. They weren't pressed down or broken from above. They were pushed outward, scattered, as though the casket had been broken open from the inside with enough force to shatter the wood, and on some of those wooden fragments, clearly visible even in the dim lamplight, were marks, scratches, long, parallel gouges that could only have been made by fingernails, by hands desperately clawing at wood, by someone or something that had been trying to get out. Sheriff Thornton was called. He examined the scene with the careful attention of a man trained to find rational explanations for disturbing events. He measured the disturbed earth. He collected pieces of the broken casket. He interviewed Martha Turner and the other witnesses. And then he descended into the grave himself, lantern in hand, to see what else might be revealed. What he found down there troubled him deeply, though he would only hint at it in his reports. The coffin had definitely been broken from within. The pattern of the wood splinters, the way the nails had been bent, all confirmed outward force. But more than that, the earth around the burial site showed signs of disturbance that made no sense. Roots were displaced, stones were moved, and the soil itself had a strange texture, compressed in some places and loose in others, creating patterns that suggested movement, as though something had churned through the earth like a swimmer through water, and there was no body. Whatever had been buried in that grave, if anything ever truly had been, was gone. The casket was empty. Elias Turner's remains, such as they were, had vanished completely. The town's doctor, a man named Everett Hayes, who'd practiced medicine for 30 years and thought himself beyond shocking, was brought in to examine the evidence. He studied the scratch marks on the casket wood under magnification and confirmed they were consistent with human fingernails, though he noted they seemed unusually deep, as though made with exceptional force or desperation. He examined the soil samples and found nothing obviously unusual, though he later confided to friends that something about the dirt bothered him, some quality he couldn't quite identify, a smell perhaps, or a texture that wasn't quite right. The town was already on edge, and this discovery pushed them toward panic. If Elias Turner's grave had been opened from within, what did that mean? That he'd been buried alive and had somehow clawed his way out? That seemed impossible. He'd never been buried in the conventional sense, had died in the mine collapse 2 years earlier. But if not that, then what? Grave robbers? That made even less sense. Who would rob the grave of a poor miner? And why would they go to such elaborate lengths to make it look like an escape from within? Martha Turner's grief, which had been terrible but manageable, transformed into something worse, a desperate hope mixed with horror. If her husband had somehow escaped the mine, survived all this time, and was now wandering confused and injured somewhere, she had to find him. But if something else had disturbed his symbolic grave, something unnatural, Then what did that mean for his soul, for his eternal rest? The Reverend tried to calm the community, preaching a special sermon about the sanctity of the dead and the impossibility of the grave being undone until Judgment Day. But even as he spoke, his own faith seemed shaken. He'd visited the Turner grave himself, had seen the evidence, and whatever he'd witnessed there had planted doubt in a mind that had previously held only certainty. Families began visiting their own loved ones' graves more frequently, checking to ensure the earth remained undisturbed. Some hired men to watch the cemetery at night, sitting with lanterns among the headstones, keeping vigil against what they couldn't say. Grave robbers, perhaps, or something worse. Something that might come from below rather than above. For 3 days nothing else happened. The Turner grave was filled in, though the earth never quite settled properly. It remained loose and uneven, as though resisting the attempt to restore order. The town tried to return to normalcy, to convince themselves that whatever had happened was a one-time occurrence, an anomaly that could be explained away or at least forgotten with time. But on the morning of October 28th, 3 days before Halloween, the watchers in the cemetery came running into town with news that shattered any hope of normalcy returning. During the night they'd heard sounds. Thuds and cracks, muffled but distinct, coming from multiple locations throughout the cemetery. And when dawn came and they could finally see clearly, they discovered that Elias Turner's grave wasn't the only one that had been disturbed. 4 more graves had opened, all of them associated with men who'd died in the mine collapse, all of them showing the same signs of disruption: earth displaced upward, caskets broken from within, scratch marks on the wood, and most disturbing of all, no bodies remaining. Whatever had been interred in those graves was gone, vanished into the October night, leaving behind only evidence of their impossible escape. The town of Clay Hollow stood at the edge of genuine terror. Something was happening that couldn't be explained, couldn't be rationalized, couldn't be stopped. The dead were rising, or something was stealing them. Or the earth itself was rejecting what had been buried within it. Whatever the explanation, it was clear that the nightmare had only just begun, and Halloween was still 3 days away. The Clay Hollow Community Church had stood at the northern edge of town for 40 years, a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple and a bell that called the faithful to worship every Sunday morning. It had witnessed births and deaths, weddings and funerals, the full cycle of human life in all its joy and sorrow. But in late October of 1903, it became something else, a fortress against the darkness, a place where the frightened gathered seeking protection from forces they couldn't understand. Reverend Samuel Phelps was a tall, gaunt man in his 60s, with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen enough of human suffering to make him simultaneously compassionate and severe. He'd come to Clay Hollow in 1888, when the mine was just being established, and the town was full of optimism and promise. He'd buried the first person to die in Clay Hollow, a child who'd succumbed to fever, and he'd thought that was the hardest thing he'd ever have to do. Then came the mine disaster, and he'd conducted 37 memorial services in the space of 2 weeks, speaking words of comfort to families whose grief was made worse by the knowledge that their loved ones would never be properly laid to rest. Now, faced with the impossible, with graves opening themselves, with the dead apparently refusing to stay buried, Phelps found his faith tested in ways he'd never imagined. He was a man of God, trained in theology and scripture, equipped with answers to life's spiritual questions. But the questions being posed by the opened graves had no scriptural parallels except in prophecy and apocalypse, in verses about the end times when the dead would rise and walk the earth. On the evening of October 28th, after the discovery of the 4 additional opened graves, Phelps called for an emergency prayer service. Nearly every remaining resident of Clay Hollow attended, packing the small church beyond its capacity, people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway. They came seeking reassurance, seeking explanation, seeking some framework that would make sense of the horror unfolding in their cemetery. Phelps stood at the pulpit, looking out over faces tight with fear, and he did his best to provide what they needed. He spoke of faith in the face of uncertainty. He spoke of God's mysterious ways and the limits of human understanding. He spoke of Job, tested beyond endurance, and of Lazarus, raised from death by divine will. He spoke of evil in the world and the Christian's duty to resist it through prayer and righteousness, But even as he spoke, he knew his words were inadequate. The opened graves weren't a test of faith. They weren't a miracle. They were something else, something that existed outside the comfortable categories of theology. They were wrong in a way that made his soul recoil, that triggered some primitive recognition of danger that went deeper than doctrine. The service had been underway for perhaps 30 minutes when it happened. Phelps was in the middle of a prayer, his voice raised in supplication, the congregation bowing their heads in reverence when the sound began. It came from beneath the church, a rhythmic thudding, like something striking wood or stone with slow, deliberate force. Boom, boom, boom. Regular as a heartbeat, loud enough to be felt through the floor, impossible to ignore or explain away. The prayer died on Phelps's lips. The congregation lifted their heads, eyes wide with terror, everyone hearing the same thing, everyone knowing they were hearing it. The sound continued, steady and insistent, for perhaps 15 seconds before it stopped. In the silence that followed, someone began to sob. Others joined in. A few people stood and moved toward the door, their nerve broken, their need to flee overcoming their need for spiritual comfort. "Wait," Phelps commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the pulpit. "Don't panic. There's an explanation. Perhaps an animal has burrowed beneath the foundation. Perhaps the ground is settling. Perhaps—" The sound came again, louder this time. And this time it was joined by others, scratching, scraping. The unmistakable sound of something moving beneath the floor, something that wanted to get in, or wanted to get out. The church erupted into chaos. People rushed for the exit, pushing and shoving in their desperation to escape. Phelps tried to maintain order, tried to calm them, but his own voice was drowned out by screams and prayers, and the sound of wooden pews scraping across the floor as people climbed over them in their haste to leave. Within 2 minutes, the church was empty, except for Phelps himself and 2 deacons who'd remained at his side out of loyalty or courage or simple paralysis. The sounds beneath the floor continued for another minute, and then stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Phelps and the deacons stood in the empty church, their hearts pounding, their faith shaken to its foundations. Whatever was happening in Clay Hollow, it wasn't confined to the cemetery. It was beneath the church now, beneath the very symbol of God's presence in the community. One of the deacons, a man named Thomas Pritchard, spoke in a hoarse whisper. "Reverend, what do we do?" Phelps had no answer. For the first time in his ministry, faced with a question from a frightened member of his flock, he had nothing to offer. No scripture came to mind, no theological framework applied. He could only stand there, listening to the silence from below, wondering what lay beneath the church and whether the floor would hold. That night, Phelps stayed in the church alone, determined to keep vigil, to face whatever came with faith as his shield. He lit every lamp, turned every page of his Bible seeking guidance, and prayed more fervently than he ever had in his life. And in the early hours of morning, exhausted and half delirious from fear and lack of sleep, he heard it again. Not the thudding this time, but something worse. Voices, muffled and distant, coming from beneath the floor, speaking words he couldn't quite make out, but that filled him with a dread so profound it felt like drowning. At dawn, when members of the congregation arrived to check on him, they found Phelps kneeling at the altar, his face pale, his hands clasped so tightly in prayer that his knuckles had gone white. He looked at them with eyes that had seen something terrible, and he said only, "They're still there, under the earth, and they're trying to speak." Later that same morning, another horror was discovered. Samuel Cobb, the cemetery caretaker, a quiet man in his 50s who'd tended the graves of Clay Hollow for 2 decades, had vanished. His wife had last seen him the previous evening when he'd announced he was going to the cemetery to investigate the opened graves, to try to understand what was happening. He'd taken his tools, shovels and picks and lanterns, and he'd walked up the hill toward the graveyard as the sun set. He'd never returned. Men went to search for him. They found his tools scattered among the graves, but not in any normal arrangement. The shovels were twisted, their wooden handles splintered as though they'd been subjected to tremendous force or heat. The metal picks were bent into impossible shapes, warped and melted in ways that shouldn't be possible from any natural source. His lanterns were shattered, The glass ground to powder, the metal frames crushed flat. But of Samuel Cobb himself there was no sign. No body, no blood, no trail leading away from the cemetery. He had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only his ruined tools and a mystery that would never be solved. His wife would spend the rest of her life waiting for him to walk through the door, refusing to believe he was truly gone, insisting that he was simply lost somewhere, that he would find his way home. The town was disintegrating under the weight of fear. People were leaving, packing what they could carry and fleeing to relatives in other counties, abandoning Clay Hollow to whatever darkness had taken root there. Those who remained did so either because they had nowhere else to go, or because they felt bound to the town by ties of blood and memory that couldn't be severed. They locked their doors at night and slept, when they could sleep at all, with weapons close at hand, though none of them could say what good a rifle or axe would do against forces that could tear open graves and twist metal like taffy. And still, Halloween approached. October 29th passed in a haze of fear and desperate prayers. October 30th brought more opened graves, 9 this time, all of them belonging to men who'd died in the mine collapse or to their family members who'd passed away in the 2 years since. The cemetery was becoming a landscape of disturbed earth and broken caskets, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had become permeable, where something was crossing over that shouldn't be able to cross. Reverend Phelps organized nightly prayer vigils, not in the church, which people now avoided, but in private homes, small groups gathering to seek protection through faith. But even these vigils were marked by strange occurrences. Lamps would flicker and die for no reason. Doors would rattle as though someone were trying to enter. And always that sound, that rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from beneath wherever people gathered, as though something was following them, tracking them through the earth itself. October 31st, 1903, arrived with clear skies and unseasonable warmth, weather that felt wrong for Halloween, that added to the sense of unreality gripping the town. All day, people moved through their routines like sleepwalkers, going through the motions of normal life while watching the sky, dreading the approach of darkness. As the sun began to set, painting the Kentucky hills in shades of orange and red that looked too much like fire, a storm rolled in from the west. It came fast, driven by winds that bent trees and sent leaves swirling through the air like clouds of insects. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer, and lightning began to flash, great jagged bolts that split the sky and cast everything in stark relief. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. The warm autumn day transformed into something that felt like the approach of winter, cold and hostile and unforgiving. And as the storm hit Clay Hollow with full force, as rain began to hammer down and wind tore at the houses, and lightning turned night into day in irregular bursts, something else began to happen. In the cemetery, the earth began to move. Later, when survivors tried to describe what happened that Halloween night, they would struggle to find words adequate to the task. How do you describe the impossible? How do you communicate an experience so far outside normal human understanding that language itself seems insufficient? But they tried. In letters and diaries, in testimony given to investigators, in stories passed down to children and grandchildren, they did their best to capture the horror of that night when the dead refused to stay buried, and the earth itself seemed determined to reject what lay within it. John Mitchell was 19 years old, the son of a miner who'd survived the 1901 collapse and subsequently died of lung disease in 1902. He was one of a group of 5 young men who'd decided they weren't going to hide from whatever was happening in Clay Hollow, that they were going to face it directly. Armed with lanterns and rifles, they'd positioned themselves at the edge of the cemetery as the storm hit, determined to witness whatever occurred and to fight it if necessary. Mitchell would later write an account of that night, a testament that would be preserved and studied by researchers for generations. His words provide the most detailed description we have of the events, though even he admitted that what he saw challenged his ability to perceive and comprehend. The storm hit around 8 in the evening, he wrote. Lightning was constant, turning the night into a strobe-like series of frozen images. Cemetery, darkness, cemetery, darkness, each flash revealing the landscape of graves and monuments in stark black and white. Thunder was so loud and continuous, it felt like standing near artillery fire. Rain came down in sheets so heavy it was difficult to breathe, and in that chaos of water and light and sound, the graves began to open. Not slowly, not one at a time, but all at once. Mitchell described it as watching the earth breathe, seeing it swell and heave like a chest drawing in air. The ground rose in dozens of locations simultaneously, mounding up and then splitting, soil pouring away like water to reveal darkness beneath. Caskets that had been buried years earlier erupted through the surface, their lids already broken, their contents spilled or missing. The group of young men stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. This wasn't grave robbers. This wasn't any human agency. The earth itself was moving, responding to some force or intelligence that operated on a scale beyond anything they'd imagined possible. And then, Mitchell saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In one of the flashes of lightning, he saw a hand emerge from disturbed earth, not digging up from below, but simply rising, as though pushing through water rather than soil. The hand was followed by an arm and then a shoulder, and then a face, pale and earth-stained, eyes open but unseeing, mouth working as though trying to draw breath. It was Jeremiah Pike, Mitchell wrote. I knew him. He'd died in the mine. We'd held a service for him 2 years ago, though his body was never recovered. But there he was, pulling himself out of the earth, covered in dirt, moving like a man waking from a deep sleep. Mitchell's companions saw it too. One of them raised his rifle, not to shoot but simply as a defensive gesture, a response to something his mind couldn't accept. Another began praying loudly, his voice barely audible over the storm. A third simply ran, his nerve broken, fleeing down the hill toward town. But Mitchell stood his ground and kept watching, and what he saw defied everything he thought he understood about life and death. All across the cemetery, figures were emerging from the broken graves. Not all of them. Many of the disturbed graves remained empty. Whatever had been buried there apparently gone or dispersed or simply absent. But enough of them. Enough to fill the cemetery with shambling, earth-stained forms that moved through the storm like sleepwalkers. They weren't alive, Mitchell insisted in his account. Whatever animated those forms, it wasn't life as he understood it. They moved wrong, their joints bending at angles that shouldn't be possible, their faces slack and expressionless. They made no sounds except for a wheezing that might have been air escaping from dead lungs, or might have been something else. Some attempt at breath by things that no longer needed oxygen, and they weren't attacking or threatening. They were simply moving, walking through the cemetery with apparent purpose, though Mitchell couldn't determine what that purpose might be. Some seemed to be searching for something. Others simply stood among the graves, faces turned toward the sky, as though waiting for something to happen, or simply experiencing the sensation of being above ground again. The vision lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though Mitchell admitted his sense of time was compromised by fear and shock. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it ended. The storm intensified, wind and rain becoming so violent that Mitchell could no longer see clearly. He and his remaining companion huddled behind a monument, protecting themselves from the worst of the weather, their lanterns long since extinguished by wind and rain. When the storm finally passed, an hour later, and they could safely emerge and look at the cemetery again, the figures were gone. The graves remained disturbed, that much was unchanged, but the walking forms, whatever they'd been, had vanished back into the earth or dispersed into the night. Mitchell and his friend made their way back to town, soaked and shaking, and reported what they'd seen. Some believed them. Many didn't, thinking the storm and fear had created hallucinations. But over the following hours, as others came forward with their own accounts, it became clear that Mitchell's experience wasn't unique. People in town had seen things too. Figures moving through the streets, shambling through the rain, their faces obscured by darkness and weather, but their forms unnaturally thin and angular. Some had heard voices, not words exactly, but sounds that might have been attempts at speech, throaty and wet and wrong. A few claimed to have seen faces at their windows, pale forms pressing against the glass, looking in with eyes that reflected light, but showed no awareness. One woman, a widow named Eleanor Gray, swore that her dead husband had come to her house that night. She'd heard a knock at the door, and without thinking had answered it. There, standing on her porch in the rain, was a figure that bore her husband's face, or something close to it, something that might have been him if you didn't look too closely. if you didn't notice the way his skin had taken on a waxy quality, or the way his eyes didn't quite focus correctly. "Eleanor," the figure had said, its voice a rasping whisper. "I'm cold." "Can I come in?" She'd screamed and slammed the door, throwing the bolt and backing away in terror. The figure had remained on the porch for several minutes, she claimed, occasionally knocking or calling her name, before finally shambling away into the storm. In the morning, when she worked up the courage to open the door, there were muddy footprints on her porch and scratches on her door where something had tried to force entry. These accounts, Mitchell's detailed testimony, Eleanor's encounter, and dozens of other fragmentary reports, paint a picture of Halloween night 1903 in Clay Hollow that seems to belong in fiction rather than history. But the evidence suggests these events actually occurred, that something genuinely inexplicable happened in that small Kentucky town, something that multiple witnesses experienced independently and reported with remarkable consistency. November 1st, 1903, dawned cold and clear. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scrubbed clean by wind and rain. As the sun rose over Clay Hollow and survivors emerged from their homes to assess the damage, they found a scene that would define the town's place in history and in the dark folklore of unexplained American mysteries. The cemetery was destroyed, not vandalized or desecrated in the conventional sense, but transformed into something that looked like a battlefield or a natural disaster site. Nearly 30 graves had been opened, their contents disturbed or missing. Caskets lay in pieces, scattered across the hillside. Monuments were toppled. The earth was churned and displaced in patterns that suggested tremendous force applied from below. But most disturbing was the absence of evidence of human agency. There were no footprints except those left by the living as they approached to investigate. There were no tool marks, no signs of digging or excavation, no wagon tracks to suggest bodies had been carted away. The graves had been opened, but not by any method that made sense according to the laws of physics and human capability. Sheriff Thornton walked through the devastation that morning, trying to document everything, trying to make sense of the impossible. He took photographs with a primitive camera, images that still exist in archives, blurry and poorly lit, but showing the scope of the destruction clearly enough. He collected samples of disturbed earth. He examined broken caskets for clues, and he wrote in his report, in words that would be sealed away and hidden for decades, "I'm a rational man trained in investigation and evidence. I do not believe in ghosts or spirits or supernatural explanations, but I cannot explain what I see before me through any framework of natural law. The earth has been displaced upward with force that would require heavy machinery, yet there are no signs of such machinery. The caskets have been broken from within, yet the bodies that should have been inside them are nowhere to be found. The only conclusion I can draw is one I cannot accept, that the dead have risen and walked from their graves. Since I cannot accept this conclusion, I must acknowledge that I simply do not know what happened here. And I'm not certain I want to know." Experts were called in from Louisville, geologists and engineers who might explain the disturbed earth through scientific means. They examined the site for evidence of sinkholes or cave systems that might have caused the ground to collapse. They tested for gas pockets that might have created explosive pressure. They looked for evidence of unusual seismic activity. They found nothing. Or rather, they found anomalies they couldn't explain. Soil samples showed chemical compositions that didn't match the surrounding area. Compass readings near the most disturbed graves fluctuated wildly. Temperature measurements revealed cold spots that persisted even in direct sunlight. And their instruments, surveying equipment, measuring devices, photographic cameras, began to malfunction for no apparent reason. Batteries would drain instantly. Film would be exposed despite being in protective containers. Compass needles would spin freely rather than pointing north. The team of experts stayed for 3 days, growing increasingly frustrated and disturbed. On the evening of the 3rd day, they packed their equipment and left, refusing to stay in Clay Hollow after dark, unwilling to risk another night in a place that seemed to operate by rules that contradicted everything they understood about the natural world. Their official report, submitted to the state of Kentucky and promptly classified, concluded that Clay Hollow had experienced an unusual geological event of indeterminate origin, and recommended that the cemetery be closed and the area monitored for signs of continued instability. But their private communications, Letters to colleagues and journal entries that survived told a different story. They spoke of feeling watched while working in the cemetery. They described dreams of being buried alive, of suffocating under tons of earth. They admitted to experiencing fear in that place that went beyond rational concern for physical safety. A primitive, instinctive terror that screamed at them to leave and never return. Meanwhile, the connection between the opened graves and the 1901 mine disaster was becoming impossible to ignore. Nearly every grave that had been disturbed belonged either to a man who died in the collapse or to family members of the trapped miners. The correlation was too strong to be coincidental. Something about that disaster, about the 37 men still entombed in the earth beneath Clay Hollow, seemed to be driving the supernatural activity. Survivors of the mine collapse, men who'd been working on other shifts or in different sections when the disaster occurred, began reporting disturbing experiences. They spoke of dreams in which they were back in the mine, trapped in darkness, hearing the voices of their dead friends calling for help. They described waking at night to the sound of tapping on their walls or beneath their floors, the same rhythmic signal miners used to communicate through rock. Some claimed to see faces at their windows, the faces of men who died in the collapse, looking in with expressions of desperate need. One survivor, a man named Jacob Weems, became convinced that the dead miners were trying to send a message, that they were trapped in some liminal state between life and death and were reaching out for help. He spent days poring over old mine maps, studying the layout of the tunnels, trying to determine if there might be a connection between the collapsed sections and the cemetery. What he discovered sent a fresh wave of horror through the already terrified community. The main gallery of the Hollow Creek mine, the section that had collapsed, entombing 37 men, ran directly beneath the Clay Hollow Cemetery. The tunnels were perhaps 50 feet below the graves, separated by solid rock, but they were there. The dead of Clay Hollow, buried in consecrated ground above, lay directly over the bodies of the miners, sealed in their tomb below. The storm on Halloween night, Weems theorized, had somehow opened or widened cracks in the rock, creating passages between the mine and the surface. Perhaps gases from decomposition had built up pressure over 2 years, and the storm had provided the final trigger for a release. Perhaps water had flooded the tunnels, creating hydraulic pressure that forced its way upward through weak points in the stone. Perhaps, and this was the explanation that terrified him most, something about having the dead above and the entombed below had created a kind of resonance, a connection that the storm had amplified into something powerful enough to break through the barrier between them. Weems presented his findings to Sheriff Thornton and a hastily convened town council. The implications were clear and horrible. If the mine tunnels were now connected to the surface, if there were passages leading up from the depths, then the possibility existed that something might come up from below. Or already had. A decision was made to send a team into the mine. The sealed entrance would be reopened, and volunteers would descend to investigate the tunnels to determine if Weems's theory had merit. If connections to the surface were found, they would be sealed. If bodies were found, they would be. Well, no one wanted to discuss what would be done if bodies were found in a state that suggested they'd been moving after death. 3 men volunteered. Weems himself, driven by a need to understand what had happened to his friends. Thomas Pritchard, one of the church deacons who felt a religious obligation to bring peace to the disturbed dead, and a young mining engineer named David Cross, who'd moved to Clay Hollow after the disaster and had no personal connection to the tragedy, but possessed both skills and courage. On November 3rd, 1903, the 3 men descended into the Hollow Creek mine. They carried lanterns, ropes, and enough supplies to last several hours. A crowd gathered at the mine entrance to see them off, watching as they disappeared into the darkness below, hoping for answers, fearing what those answers might be. Hours passed. Then more hours. Darkness fell, and still the 3 hadn't returned. People built fires near the mine entrance and waited through the night, unwilling to leave, unable to help. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the mine entrance, willing the 3 men to emerge. Dawn came. The mine remained silent. Sheriff Thornton organized a second rescue party. But before they could descend, something happened that ended any hope of finding the 3 men alive or completing their mission. Deep within the earth, something shifted. Those waiting at the mine entrance felt it, a tremor that shook the ground beneath their feet, followed by a sound like distant thunder. Dust and stale air rushed out of the mine entrance, driven by pressure from below. And then, with a grinding crash that could be heard across the valley, the remaining tunnels collapsed. The earth above the mine subsided several feet, creating a depression that ran in a line from the entrance to the cemetery. Trees tilted and fell. The old mine buildings shuddered and partially collapsed. And when the dust finally settled, it was clear that the Hollow Creek mine had sealed itself completely, taking whatever secrets it held, and taking Jacob Weems, Thomas Pritchard, and David Cross into the earth forever. Clay Hollow had claimed 3 more victims. The tally of the dead and missing, from the original disaster to the events of Halloween 1903, now stood at 43. And the mystery, rather than being solved, had been buried even deeper than before. In the days following the final mine collapse, authorities arrived in Clay Hollow with a clear agenda. They weren't there to investigate or understand. They were there to contain, to suppress, to make the problem disappear through administrative means, if it couldn't be solved through rational inquiry. Reverend Samuel Phelps, who'd maintained his vigil throughout the crisis, despite his own terror, called for a mass burial of the remains that could still be identified. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving the cemetery in its current state of desecration, couldn't accept that the dead would be denied proper rest because of forces beyond anyone's control. The ceremony was scheduled for November 7th. Volunteers, those few who remained in Clay Hollow, and those who traveled from neighboring communities out of respect or curiosity, worked to prepare a mass grave at the highest point of the cemetery, a location that the geologists had declared stable and unlikely to be affected by any further disturbances. Bodies and fragments were gathered from the destroyed graves. In many cases, there was little to inter: bone fragments, pieces of coffin, dirt that had been soaked with decay. But Phelps insisted that even these traces deserved sanctification, that every effort must be made to give the disturbed dead some measure of peace. The burial was set for noon, with the entire service planned to be completed before darkness fell. No one wanted to be in that cemetery after sunset, not after what had happened on Halloween night. Phelps prepared a sermon about eternal rest and the promise of resurrection, about laying down burdens and finding peace in God's arms. But the ceremony never finished. As Phelps stood at the edge of the mass grave, as he raised his voice in prayer with the sun shining down and the assembled mourners bowing their heads, the ground began to shake. It started as a tremor, slight but noticeable, then stronger. People stumbled and caught themselves, looking around in alarm. The shaking intensified, becoming violent enough that several people fell. A sound rose from beneath them, a rumbling groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, and then, impossibly, horrifically, the mass grave began to open. Not from the sides, not from any natural collapse, but from the bottom, as though something beneath was pushing upward with terrible force. The soil that had been carefully placed began to fountain upward, spraying into the air. The bodies and fragments that had been laid to rest tumbled back out, scattered across the cemetery by force from below. A cold mist poured out of the opening grave, not smoke or steam, but something else, something thick and grey that moved against the wind, that spread across the ground like a living thing. The mist extinguished lanterns as it touched them, plunging portions of the cemetery into shadow, despite the bright afternoon sun. People screamed and ran. The orderly burial dissolved into panic as mourners fled down the hill, desperate to escape whatever was manifesting before them. Only Reverend Phelps remained, standing at the edge of the mass grave, staring down into the darkness from which the cold mist poured. Those who looked back saw him sway, saw his hand clutch at his chest. He tried to speak, his mouth working, but no sound emerged. Then he collapsed, falling to his knees at the grave's edge, his face going grey, his body convulsing. Men ran back to help him, dragging him away from the grave, carrying him down the hill to the church. A doctor was called, but there was nothing to be done. Reverend Samuel Phelps had suffered a massive heart failure, and he died within minutes, surrounded by members of his congregation, his lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been an attempt to communicate something he'd seen in those final moments. Later, when his body was being prepared for burial, a burial that would not take place in Clay Hollow but in a cemetery 2 counties away. Where his family insisted he be laid to rest far from the cursed ground, someone found a message scrawled in his pocket Bible. The handwriting was barely legible, written with a shaking hand, but the words were clear enough. They want air. They were buried alive, the mine. They're still there, still alive, still breathing, still calling for help. God forgive us for leaving them. The message made no sense. The mine disaster had happened 2 years earlier. The men who'd died had been trapped, yes, but they'd suffocated or been crushed by the collapse. They couldn't still be alive. It was impossible, unless Phelps had meant something else, unless he was trying to communicate a truth more disturbing than the physical facts allowed. Unless in those final moments, standing at the edge of that impossible grave with cold mist pouring out around him, he'd understood something about what was happening beneath Clay Hollow that no one else had grasped. But whatever revelation he'd had died with him. And the mystery deepened. Within a week of Reverend Phelps's death, the state of Kentucky moved decisively to close the Clay Hollow incident. The cemetery was officially sealed, declared unsafe for any use, and barricaded to prevent public access. Families were forbidden from exhuming their dead or conducting any further burials. The entire hilltop was designated a geological hazard zone. The Louisville Courier, which had been following the story with increasing sensationalism, published one final article on November 10, 1903. The piece was brief and deliberately vague, mentioning only that unusual geological activity in Clay Hollow had resulted in cemetery damage and several deaths, and that authorities were working to ensure public safety. That article was pulled from circulation within hours of publication. Copies disappeared from newsstands and libraries. The newspaper's editor received a visit from state officials who made it clear that no further coverage of Clay Hollow would be tolerated. The story, they said, was causing unnecessary public panic and interfering with legitimate government operations. But copies of that article survived, hidden in private collections, preserved by people who knew they were witnessing a cover-up and wanted to preserve some record of the truth. And alongside that article, in the weeks and months that followed, came letters, private correspondence from people who'd lived in Clay Hollow or witnessed the events, writing to friends and relatives, trying to process what they'd experienced. These letters, scattered across dozens of archives and family collections, provide a window into the aftermath of the Halloween 1903 events. They speak of trauma and terror, of lives permanently scarred by experiences that couldn't be explained or forgotten. They describe the slow death of Clay Hollow as families continued to leave, as businesses closed, as the town withered and died like a plant cut off from sunlight. One letter, written by Margaret Holloway to her sister in December 1903, is particularly haunting. "We left Clay Hollow last week. James insisted we go, and I couldn't argue. I haven't slept properly since Halloween. Every night I hear sounds beneath the house, tapping and scraping, like something trying to dig up from below. James says it's my imagination, that we're safe now, but I know what I hear. Those men are still down there in the mine, and they're not at rest. They can't die properly because they were never properly buried, and they can't live because they're already dead. They're trapped in between, and they're angry about it. Angry or desperate or lost. I don't know which, but I know they're still there. Beneath the earth, moving through the darkness, calling for help that will never come." Another letter, from Sheriff Thornton to a colleague in a neighboring county, reveals the toll the events took on those tasked with maintaining order. "I've submitted my resignation effective January 1st. I can't continue in this position, can't continue living in Clay Hollow, can't sleep in a place where the ground itself seems hostile to human presence. I've seen things I can't explain and don't want to remember. I've watched good people driven mad by fear of what lies beneath them. I've stood in that cemetery and felt the earth move under my feet, felt it breathe like a living thing. Whatever is under Clay Hollow, it isn't finished. It's still there, still active, still waiting. And I won't be here when it decides to surface again." The federal government became involved in early 1904, though the exact nature of their interest remains unclear. Classified documents from that period, partially declassified in the 1980s, show that the U.S. Geological Survey conducted extensive surveys of the Clay Hollow area, that the Department of the Interior filed reports about subsurface anomalies and that the War Department, for reasons never explained, stationed observers in the region for several months. What were they looking for? What did they find? The declassified documents raise more questions than they answer. They contain references to unusual seismic patterns, to localized gravitational anomalies, to evidence of extensive subsurface voiding not consistent with known geological formations. They mention instrumentation failures and personnel discomfort due to environmental factors, but the most intriguing references are the ones that remain redacted. Entire pages are blacked out. Sections labeled witness testimony and physical evidence analysis are completely censored. Whatever the government investigators found in Clay Hollow, whatever conclusions they drew, remain classified to this day. By mid-1904, Clay Hollow was effectively abandoned. The last families moved away. The church was closed and boarded up. The general store's owner simply walked away, leaving merchandise on the shelves and money in the register, unable to continue living in a place that had become synonymous with inexplicable horror. The schoolhouse stood empty, its desks still arranged in neat rows, books still on the shelves, waiting for students who would never return. And beneath it all, the mine tunnels remained, collapsed and sealed but not gone, a maze of darkness beneath the abandoned town where 37 men and later 3 more had met their ends and, if the testimony is to be believed, had never truly departed. Over the decades that followed, Clay Hollow slowly returned to nature. Buildings collapsed or were reclaimed by vegetation. Roads disappeared under layers of fallen leaves and new growth. The cemetery, sealed and barricaded, gradually became overgrown with briars and saplings. The mine entrance, buried under tons of rock and earth, became invisible, absorbed back into the hillside. But the stories didn't die. They couldn't die because they were too powerful, too deeply embedded in the memories of those who'd experienced them. The Halloween night when the graves opened themselves became a legend, passed down through generations, told and retold until it was impossible to separate fact from embellishment, historical record from folklore. Paranormal investigators began visiting the site in the 1960s and 1970s, drawn by the legend, equipped with tape recorders and cameras and various instruments designed to detect supernatural activity. Many reported unusual findings. Temperature fluctuations that couldn't be explained by weather or geography. Electromagnetic readings that spiked and dropped without apparent cause. And most commonly sounds. The same thuds and taps and scrapes that residents of Clay Hollow had reported 70 years earlier, seemingly emanating from beneath the earth. In 1982, a team from a university parapsychology program spent 3 nights at the Clay Hollow site with professional recording equipment. They captured hours of audio, most of it mundane sounds of wind and wildlife. But in one section of tape, recorded around midnight on the second night, there's something else. A low-frequency vibration, rhythmic and regular, that sounds unsettlingly like breathing. Deep inhalations and exhalations, as though the earth itself were alive. Were drawing air into vast lungs buried beneath the soil. The team also recorded what they identified as possible vocalizations, sounds that might be interpreted as human voices, distorted and distant, speaking words that can't quite be made out. When the tapes were analyzed and the sounds isolated and amplified, some listeners claimed to hear phrases, "Help us," "Let us out," "So dark." Others heard only random noise. The ambiguity of the recordings made them simultaneously tantalizing and frustrating. Evidence of something but not proof of anything. The team's published report concluded that the Clay Hollow site exhibits characteristics consistent with residual haunting phenomena, and that further investigation is warranted, but they never returned. When asked why, the team leader would only say that there was something wrong about that place that goes beyond professional curiosity, and that he couldn't ethically subject students to whatever is there. Today, more than a century after Halloween 1903, Clay Hollow exists only as a name on old maps and in collections of unusual American mysteries. The town is gone, the people are gone. Even the physical traces, buildings and roads and cemetery monuments, have been absorbed back into the Kentucky landscape, leaving only subtle irregularities in the terrain to suggest human habitation ever existed there. But the story persists. It appears in books about unexplained phenomena and American hauntings. It's discussed on forums and podcasts devoted to the paranormal. Every year, particularly around Halloween, people make pilgrimages to the site, searching for the place where graves once opened themselves, hoping to experience something of the terror and wonder that gripped Clay Hollow in those final days of October 1903. Most find nothing but forest and hills, earth and stone indistinguishable from any other rural Kentucky location. But some, a surprising number actually, report experiences that echo the original events. They describe feeling the ground move beneath them, subtle tremors that don't register on seismographs, but can be felt through the soles of boots. They report hearing sounds from below, muffled and distant, that might be settling rock or might be something else. They take photographs that show unexplained lights or shadows, though skeptics rightfully note that such images are easy to fake or misinterpret, and a very few, report seeing them. The figures. Moving through the trees or standing among the overgrown mounds that might be unmarked graves. Earth-stained forms that watch the living, with eyes that reflect light but show no awareness. Shapes that vanish when approached or photographed, leaving behind only disturbed soil and the smell of earth and decay. Are these experiences real? Are the dead of Clay Hollow still restless, still trapped in whatever liminal state they entered on Halloween 1903? Or are they simply products of suggestion and expectation, the power of a good story to shape perception and create experiences where none objectively exist? The question might not be answerable, but the physical evidence, the historical records, the newspaper accounts, the testimony of witnesses, the reports filed by investigators, suggest that something genuinely extraordinary happened in Clay Hollow, something that multiple people experienced independently, something that left traces in the landscape and in official documents, something that was significant enough to trigger a government cover-up. The most reasonable explanation might be that a combination of geological factors, subsidence from the mine collapse, methane gas buildup, groundwater infiltration, and seismic activity triggered by the Halloween storm created conditions that disrupted the cemetery graves in dramatic ways. Add in the power of suggestion, the atmosphere of fear in a community already traumatized by mining disaster, and the timing of Halloween itself, and you have ingredients for mass hysteria and false perceptions. But that explanation doesn't account for all the evidence. It doesn't explain the scratch marks on caskets, made from the inside. It doesn't explain the twisted metal tools or the malfunctioning instruments. It doesn't explain the consistent reports of figures moving through the town, of voices calling from below the earth, of experiences that continued long after the initial events and extended far beyond the boundaries of Clay Hollow itself. And it certainly doesn't explain the message Reverend Phelps left in his Bible. They want air. What did he mean? The simplest interpretation is that the trapped miners, dying of suffocation in the collapsed tunnels, had wanted air in their final moments. But Phelps wrote those words 2 years after the disaster, in the context of graves opening themselves and cold mist pouring from the earth. Was he suggesting that the miners were somehow still alive, still breathing in some impossible way? Or was he communicating something more metaphorical, that the dead need acknowledgement, need their stories told, need to be remembered rather than sealed away and forgotten? In the end, Clay Hollow offers no comfortable answers. It remains a mystery wrapped in tragedy, a story that resists neat resolution. The graves opened themselves on Halloween 1903. That much seems certain. How and why they opened, where the bodies went, what the witnesses truly saw, and whether it continues to this day. Those questions remain suspended between history and legend, fact and folklore, the rational and the impossible. The ground where Clay Hollow once stood is quiet now, at least to casual observation. The forest has reclaimed it. Wildlife has returned. To all appearances, it's just another piece of Kentucky hill country, unremarkable and peaceful. But those who've studied the case, who've read the accounts and examined the evidence, who've perhaps visited the site and stood where the cemetery once was, know that appearances can be deceiving. They know that beneath the peaceful surface, the mine tunnels still exist, collapsed but not destroyed, filled with darkness and 37 bodies that were never properly laid to rest. They know that the earth moves in patterns that sometimes defy easy explanation. That sounds emerge from below. That might be geological settling or might be something else. They know that on certain nights, particularly around Halloween, the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin. And they know that in Clay Hollow, that boundary might have been permanently damaged, torn open by forces no one fully understood, leaving a wound in reality that has never properly healed. The dead should rest quietly in their graves. The earth should hold them gently, returning them to the elements from which they came. These are comforting assumptions that most of us carry through life without examination. But Clay Hollow suggests those assumptions might not always hold. Sometimes the earth rejects what we bury in it. Sometimes the dead don't rest. Sometimes they want air. And sometimes on Halloween nights in forgotten places, where tragedy and injustice have soaked into the soil, the graves open themselves. Not from above, but from below. Not through human agency, but through something else. Call it the restlessness of improperly buried souls. Call it geological anomaly. Call it the earth itself rebelling against the wrongness done within it. Call it what you will, but know that it happened in Clay Hollow, Kentucky, in October of 1903, and know that according to some, it's still happening. The ground still breathes. The dead still move. And beneath the abandoned town where no one lives anymore, something waits in the darkness, trapped between life and death, calling for help that will never come. The Halloween night when the graves opened themselves has never truly ended. It continues year after year, century after century. In that patch of Kentucky earth, where the boundary between the living and the dead proved to be far more permeable than anyone had imagined. And if you ever find yourself in eastern Kentucky, driving through hills thick with autumn color, and you come across a place that feels wrong, where the forest is too quiet, where the ground seems unstable beneath your feet, where you hear sounds that might be wind or might be something else, keep moving. Don't stop. Don't investigate, because some places are marked by events so powerful they never fade, so wrong they can't be forgotten, so dark they cast shadows that span generations. Clay Hollow is one of those places, and on Halloween night the dead still remember what was done to them, and they still want air,